Hi guys, welcome to this tutorial on London by William Blake. This is part of the Power and Conflict section in AQA's English Literature Anthology. Okay, so some key context there at the top. London is part of Blake's Songs of Experience collection of poems, which is the sort of flip side of his Songs of Innocence collection. And really this Songs of Experience focuses on the gritty, dark, difficult side of life, and particularly focuses on poverty, deprivation, and just sort of the disenfranchised and desperate people of London, rather than Songs of Innocence that really focuses on beautiful imagery, childhood, innocence, and the natural world. Blake, as you may know, is a romantic poet and therefore really values that sort of the beauty of nature. Bit of a backlash against the growing industrialisation in this country. Okay, so London then takes the view of this first-person narrator, almost a tourist, who appears to be wandering around London, clearly observing, absorbing the sights, the sounds, and it is quite a sensory poem in many ways. So we get that I wander. Think about the verb wander. It has quite an aimlessness to it. It's someone meandering around. There isn't a real purpose to that movement, and that again creates that sense of a somewhat detached narrative voice. I wander through each chartered street near where the chartered Thames does flow. So this repetition of chartered. So the royal charters, they controlled trade. They sort of gave out licenses in effect to, I suppose, corporate entities. Class oppression is a key theme in this poem. And I think one thing that I find quite interesting is that in his original version, he used dirty here rather than chartered, but obviously revised it and thought actually the filth was less of an issue and a problem than the idea that parts of the city were no-go areas if you were poor, or the places with best access to water and infrastructure were kind of owned by these sort of businesses. So the Thames, if you go to London now, it's a very pleasant experience to sort of walk around the river. But at that point, the point 1794 when Blake's writing, it's filthy, it's contaminated, it's diseased, there's dead bodies. So it's a filthy and sort of squalid environment to be wandering around. And then in these next two lines, and mark in every face I meet, marks of weakness, marks of woe. So this technique of mark, it's antanaclasis, which is where you get a repeated word, but it's actually got a different meaning. So mark here is meaning I notice, and mark meaning sort of signs of weakness. So he notices in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. And so we get these vision of sort of the suffering of humanity. And I think that's reiterated by the quantitative adjective every, it's all consuming. The majority of people are miserable and they are suffering, and we get the sense the marks, they're the visible signs of poverty and deprivation, but there's also, you can see something about them that's metaphorical in terms of its impact. And then we get the anaphora in stanza 2 of in every, really reinforcing that sense of it's overwhelming. In every cry of man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind forged manacles I hear. There's something interesting, I read this about, the idea of stereotypical kind of gender roles, the cry of every man. Now, man might be being used here in terms of humanity, mankind. It could also be sort of quite a shocking flouting of gender roles, because men, shouldn't be seen to cry and show weakness, and yet these men are in such a desperate state of suffering that they're even crying. Quite shocking. So I think you've got a couple of interpretations of that. But then in the infant's cry, we see that suffering for people in London is from birth to death. You know, it's a endless cycle of misery. And then the mind-forged manacles, which is a great metaphor to talk about here. This compound adjective, mind-forged. And I've just made a note here about these long vowels echoing the restriction or imprisonment. The mind-forged. Those vowel sounds of eind and forged, they kind of make it feel drawn out. The manacles, we know, are kind of metallic kind of cuffs and chains. And the idea then that imprisonment is not necessarily a cell or a prison block, but it's something created in the mind because you're born into poverty and deprivation. It's very hard to see a route out of there. It's very difficult to see how your life could ever change. I just thought that was an interesting quote by Rousseau. Man was born free, everywhere he is in chains. Okay, moving on to stanza 3. We focus then on a sort of specific example here, how the chimney sweepers cry. We know that chimney sweepers this time in London were often children, very young children, and so it sort of focuses on that abuse of innocence, you know, sent up chimneys, they were frightened, it was dangerous, so we've got this image of children suffering. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldiers' sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So there's a criticism here of the church as an institution, as a structure. And blackening takes on two meanings here. Blackening literally from the soot and filth and coal dust from these factories. Literally buildings in London were sort of filthy and dirty looking. But equally blackening used here to sort of talk about the sullied reputation in being complicit in a sort of going along with some of the government's sort of things around looking after the poor or not looking after the poor. There's a criticism that the church's own reputation has been sullied, and there's also an attack here as well on the responsibility of leaders, you know, the government and also, you know, the crown, the royal family, in terms of the hapless soldier sigh runs in blood down palace walls. So the hapless soldier, you know, these soldiers who are signing up for wars, losing their lives in futile kind of conflicts. And, you know, we think about the imagery of having blood on your hands, but in this case, it runs in blood down the palace walls. So it's the idea of this responsibility is on leaders, and they've got blood on their hands, even on their own buildings. Something interesting here is around, this is acrostic here, H-E-A-R, and oh, excuse me, it creates an aural impact, A-U-R-A-L, aural, as in the things we can hear. So it's not just about the sights of London, it's the sounds and things as well. This is, as I said, a very sensory poem, overwhelming the narrator's senses as they walk the streets. Conjunction here, but most, introduces the climax of the poem. You know, all of these things that he's seen and heard are terrible, but most of all, through the midnight streets I hear. So the fact that we've got a shift here into nighttime, the darkness, the fear, always symbolic of kind of evil deeds, things, shady doings. He hears how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hers. You get this sort of really bleak and terrible imagery here of a young, you know, child prostitute, a harlot here. But she is no more a child, you know, she's cursing and she's blasting the newborn infant. And actually, she is there as a mother, but a terrifying one, herself still a child. And we're reminded of, you know, the unwanted children at this time. You know, prostitution is an issue, STIs are an issue, unwanted, abandoned babies are issues. And so we have, you know, the wealthy not yet in the Victorian era, but the wealthy men kind of using using the services of prostitutes and these children then born. And this image here of a terrified child is quite significant. Equally, Blighting with Plagues, the marriage hearse, focuses on the STIs, which may have impacted on not only those suffering from them, but are going back into the sort of the happy family and ultimately corrupting that. And you get that in that oxymoronical image of marriage and death, the marriage and the hearse. The blight, a blight is something that mars, that destroys and plagues. We get this sense of the disease. So we've got this sort of wider societal impact of the prostitution, of the harlotry here, and leaving it on that really sort of terrible final image there of STIs being taken back to the sort of the safe homes. So a dark poem, a poem that really flags up the ills in society, the problems with society, the poverty, the inequality, the hypocrisy of a society where people visit prostitutes, but there is, the wider impact of that in terms of these terrified, guilt-free, innocent babies that are growing up in terrible conditions, and equally these STIs going back into the homes of families and corrupting society at large. So you can see the degree of sort of social protest and that Blake is really trying to focus here. So a few key terms, I don't know if I've mentioned all of these. Compound adjective I did, anaphora. The syntactic parallelism, so kind of lines constructed in a similar way. The antanaclasis we talked about, it's a dramatic monologue. And then just another structural point about these being quatrains and a tetrameter structure, so 4 iambic feet per line. Rather than pentameter, which you might be familiar with 5 feet per line. Okay, so I hope that was useful. Thinking about poems you can link it to works well with any that are to do with power. So Ozymandias works quite well to compare it to, but you can equally look at the abuse of power from leaders in kind of some of the war poems. Just as easily works quite well with those as well. I think it works nicely even with things like My Last Duchess in terms of abuse of power. Okay, I hope that was useful. Thanks for watching. See you next time.